All right, so welcome aboard to the second of our four-part course in public policy analysis. And so what I'm going to quickly go through is go through the first few slides that we covered, just as a sort of recap of what we had discussed the last time we were here together. And also for the benefit of those that were not here with us the last time. So just a little quick catch up. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the first few slides. I sent the recording out to everybody. So those that could not attend the first class can certainly go and review the recording and pick up some of the conversations we had. We had a very interesting, wouldn't you agree, Swati? There was a very interesting dialogue last time. A lot of people jumped in and shared their thoughts, shared their ideas with us on what constitutes public policy and policy analysis and all of that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to also say that the focus of our public policy analysis course on the interpretative lens, which is kind of like quasi-quantitative, quasi-qualitative. It has a bit of both, but it's not, I would say it's heavily qualitative rather than quantitative, because there's a lot of meaning making, sense making, thoughts, feelings, emotions of policyholders, and both policyholders and policy, or those that are affected or impacted by certain policies. So, so that's really the focus is interpretative. Interpretative is really typically a lens through which we look at something, right? So there are many lenses. There's a critical theoretical lens. There's a ethno lens, which looks at the cultural aspect of things. There's a interpretative. There's a hermeneutic lens through which we look at stuff. So the focus of our work together is on the interpretative lens. It's not on the typical values-driven cost-benefit analysis, the quantitative piece that many of you are probably familiar with. All right, so this would be a new look into something that's somewhat of a emergent field right now. And even though the interpretative approach has been gaining ground over the last almost a decade, but it is now coming of age. More and more policy analysts and policy makers are understanding the value that an interpretative lens brings to this. So public policy analysis is a social and political enterprise. It's important to understand the elements of social and political anytime you're doing policy work. It affects the well-being and lives of a large number of individuals and citizenry. Obviously, when you're creating policies, there's a tremendous amount of impact that the policies are going to have on the lives of people. Okay, it involves a process where a number of stakeholders might have a say. So a lot of stakeholders, when I say stakeholders, I mean people that are affected by the policy, but also the policymakers. Okay, so it involves an interactional process, international dialogic process between stakeholders and those that are affected by public policies. There's an immediate consumer, maybe a client or a superior. So this is just to say that, so sometimes the CEO of a firm may have you come in and do policy analysis. So the CEO becomes your client, but also sometimes you're in-house working for an organization, an NGO, think tank. And so you're an employee and you're doing work for your CEO, in which case your CEO becomes your supervisor and or a superior. Oftentimes the thought that comes to mind is, what is public policy analysis? Is it an art or is it a science? And we had a pretty protracted conversation about art or science the last time we were here together. And essentially you can look at it as somewhat of a linear process. just to understand what are the building blocks of policy analysis. So you define, obviously you have to define a situation, you provide evidence, data, alternatives um, to policymakers. You select what criteria you're going to have, right, to have that policy in place. You brainstorm possible outcomes and trade-offs, clearly through a discussion with people. You provide a story or a narrative, right? All right, because anytime you're doing this kind of cyclical process, there's some narrative, some story, or something that comes out of it, based on which we create policies. All right. So just to share this diagrammatic thing. Now, policy analysis is an ongoing. So now you might get confused. In the previous slide, which let me go back there. If you see that the arrows are going in one direction, so which sort of means that while this is cyclical, right? It can be, you don't necessarily have to start at defining the situation, although that is for the most part what we do. You can also be at one of the other building blocks and kind of like go in this cyclical sort of process. But if you look at this one, you see that I'm speaking something that is contradictory to the previous slide, because now I'm saying it's an iterative cycle. So it doesn't mean that it follows from one block right here to this, to this, to this, and so forth and so on. I'm saying that it does not follow what is known as a linear in one straight line. You could be anywhere in this process. And you may have to go back and forth through a process of iteration. Iteration is looking at something that you've looked at before, then going back and taking a look at something else, then going back maybe again to review what you had talked about earlier. So it's that process of through trial and error, through making mistakes, through understanding how people are constructing meaning out of that. So it's a very organic, very emergent type of process. And one of the things I always mention to my students is, and I know this is the hardest part, a lot of our students are so embedded in theories, constructs, etc., that they're all the time theorizing. Okay, how can I understand, or how can I relate to, or how can I interpret something through a theoretical lens? Okay. It's so easy to do, because if you have a theory, you can instantly jump from one place to another and just say, hey, this is what I can explain from this certain theory. But in the interpretative realm, we initially steer away, we shy away from political theorizing or social constructivist theorizing. And you'll hear the expression social constructivism a lot in the interpretative approach. And by the way, I shared some very interesting papers, including a full-length book on interpretative policy analysis. I'm sure some of you have started to read. By no means was I expecting that all of you have read all of the resources that I shared with you. But what I was saying was it's a good idea to keep pace with that and to read up a little bit, because this is a work in progress. It's not something that you're going to be able to achieve, or I'm going to be able to achieve overnight, or in 3 sessions or 4 sessions together with you. So allow yourself to immerse in this new way, in this new approach of policymaking and policy design. All right. So we talked last time about policy analysis and interpretative policy analysis, an ongoing debate. Those that are heavily into quantitative approaches which are cost benefit analysis, which are based on scientific methods, which are based on models. Uh, I'm not totally sold that a subjective element is of any use, because what they feel is that positivist work, okay, a positivist framework speaks better to a policy, and especially because of the historical makeup. Historically, that's how the microeconomic theories, macroeconomic theories have come into play. There's a lot of other disciplines that policymakers draw from in order to make sense of something, in order to construct a policy. Now, the interpretative approach also is very eclectic, also is very multidisciplinary, but the focus of the approach is different. So for instance, in mainstream analysis, when I say mainstream analysis, which I'm really talking about, is quantitative analysis. The area of study, it focuses on pragmatic, client-centered advice, decision-making tools, focus on theories, models, and historically relevant framework. Nothing wrong with that. That's the way it's been done for years and years. But by contrast, an interpretative analysis is a highly intuitive process. It's discursive. It focuses on language, on context, on emergence, on the unexpected variables, on multiple perspectives. So there's a multiplicity of viewpoints, kind of like really a truly pluralistic approach, right? Where everybody's views, thoughts, feelings about something come into play. It uses a philosophy of Hand. This is, you're going to hear this, a German word. Hand is really a rejection of positivist science and quantitative approaches to solving problems or constructing theories. So just a quick primer on that. The interpretive policy analysis and design, and it is an escape from positivism. IPA is an approach. When I say IPA, it's really the interpretive acronym for interpretative policy analysis. It's an approach to research and evaluation that makes room for human subjectivity. Now, typically in quantitative approaches, you're not going to hear the word subjectivity, okay? Because, typically the social science researcher using a quantitative approach has a hands-off relationship with the respondent. And the idea is not to corrupt the research with the researcher's own biases, thoughts, assumptions about something. So they want to focus in on a predominantly positivist, predominantly pragmatic approach, a practical approach to solving problems. The interpretive policy analysis can help us better address the pressing policy issues of our time, such as climate change, continuing discrimination of women, hostility towards refugees and migrants, and rising global economic and health inequities, especially now in the area of, especially in the pandemic atmosphere that we are currently in. There's a tremendous amount of changes that are going on. It isn't business as usual, okay? Everybody's just showing up. You have to show up as masks, otherwise you're not allowed entry into certain establishments, certain workplaces. And how does mask wearing, or how do these policies impact the person or the organization or the context in which we are embedded today, in our relationships with each other? We've all heard that during the pandemic time, people have been very depressed, okay, because that human element was missing to a large extent. And now things are opening up a little bit as people are getting vaccinated. But how do those policies impact our day-to-day lives, all right? Would be something to consider. So how do you analyze a policy that has been put in place, for instance, the policy of mask wearing, okay, or the policy that it's mandatory for 65 plus or whoever to get vaccinated first. And what about all those people that are anti-vaxxers, okay, that don't want the vaccination, okay? Uh, so how do we reconcile between these forces, okay? So so that would be one of the things that a public policy analyst needs to look at. So you may be invited as part of a think tank by the CEO of an organization to come in and understand, or a government organization to come in and understand and make sense of what's currently happening out there. All right, because it can be extremely stressful, to say the least. So I'd shared with you all a paper. I believe it was by Dr. Cohen Bartels from University of Birmingham. Um, Either a paper or one of the links I'd shared. I'm not sure what it was, but you can look it up. And these are some of the thoughts that I'm sharing with you from that piece. It was a very, very interesting piece. I know what it was. I think it was a link that I had pulled off of the internet from the University of Birmingham. And Dr. Cohen Bartels is one of the professors of public policy and change there. And he has a very, very interesting piece. It's kind of, and I picked that for a reason, because I wanted it to be a beginning, a rudimentary look into this aspect. All right, because we cannot jump to the more dense public policy making, etc., without first looking at the very elementary pieces of that. So consider all of these factors like climate change, continued discrimination, hostility, refugees and immigrants, rising global economic and health inequalities, and a lot of the social change programs are so active right now in India. And I'm sure you guys can speak to that a lot. And I'm going to give you the stage in a few minutes to share with us how you've been involved in public policy and change and analysis uh, in the Indian context, and perhaps you can share with all of us your experiences of public policy. Um, so let me go to the next slide. This is another one of the wonderful resource uh, which I thought I'd share with you, and I've shared this in the folder. I'm pretty certain. Policies are inevitably understood in different ways which are bound to conflict and come with significant differences in power, values, and interests. So what traditionally happens is this element of power, values, and interests is muted or watered down in traditional policy analysis. It doesn't make room for this subjectivity, for this diversity of interpretations, or how people look at certain things in a certain way. It is done in a very structured, very methodical way. And I'm talking about the quantitative way of doing it. And what we don't make room for, okay, continues to be like the elephant in the room that nobody's talking about, right? So somebody who has been entrusted with building a policy, developing a policy, or doing policy analysis, looks at the situation, defines the problem area, says, all right, so we are going to do this based on whatever limited knowledge we have about that area of study. And a policy comes into force. It's kind of like, oftentimes it's a knee-jerk reaction. Something is happening, so in order to counteract that, in order to fix that situation, it's kind of like a Band-Aid approach. You put a Band-Aid over something and it's just going to, pain is just going to go away, or the cut is going to not be seen. The important thing to understand is that there is always, under every policy framework, there is a great deal of interpretation. You cannot stop people from making sense of, making meaning of something just because you are interested with policymaking and you want to do it your way without making room for their interpretations. Uh, it leaves a lot of issues that are unaddressed. Okay. And as Heidrun AM of the Norwegian Institute of Science and Technology aptly put it in her paper, we need an interpretative approach or interpretive approach, the same thing, that is sensitive to meaning making. And you'll start to hear this expression in interpretation, meaning making, and sense making, multiplicity and struggles over ideas, right? What is this thing that we call struggles over ideas? So people from a think tank are working together, right? There are 3 or 4 so-called gurus or social scientists that are working together over an issue, and they're designing, and without keeping in mind how their policies are going to be impacting or affecting others. And so there's a struggle that is happening over ideas. I mean, what should we institute? What should we implement from a, shall we say, an interpretative approach if we are just going to sit here and define the problem or develop a framework for a policy without taking into consideration how the policies are going to be affecting other people? We are only doing what I would say a half ... app work over it. We're not giving ourselves fully into that policy making. So seeking to understand and explain the political or the practical bearings of specific meanings that are expressed and mobilized. And this part here I want to just touch on, because I think it's a very, very critical aspect here. So I want to hear from those of you, and many of you, I know, not all of you, but many of you are already engaged. You are either studying public policy or part of a public policy think tank, or involved with an NGO that's into change, social change. I'd like to hear from you. What is this thing that we call the multiplicity, this power struggles, this meaning making and sense making, and how do you think that this plays into the public policy debate? So I'm going to open up the floor to some of your thoughts. Anybody that would like to share something about this? Because interpretation is hermeneutics, and hermeneutics is meaning making, sense making about something meaning any phenomena that you're working with. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Preeti.
Hi. Well, I mean, in some ways, I had used a framework such as this for my own research earlier. And this is an example from there. So I was looking at a strand of policy making for, I was looking at policy making for a strand of broadcast media. And I was looking at the various policy actors involved and how they had some kind of value constructions about this form of media I was looking at. It's for something called community radio, which is about how communities and groups use various forms of localized media to for freedom of expression, to express and to sort of lay claim to their social security measures, etc. So it's a rights-based kind of a paradigm from which people operate and use this form of media. So when policy making for something like this happens, how do they draw on larger frameworks that have been developed for media studies, like the ideas of public interest, which are all key values that you draw on? And how do they interpret certain ideas and values associated with this form of media? That was something I was looking at. So, I mean, you could tell me if I'm close to.
So, yeah, so we'll discuss in a second. You bring up a very interesting aspect when you said, and I wrote it down, value construction. So this is the one thing that is heavily entrenched in the traditional public policy framework. When I say traditional,
Right.
I'm meaning the more positivist framework. That's the way it's been done. And there's nothing wrong with that. To understand values, okay, because we get so fixated on the values, right? The construction of values, how are people understanding values, right? That become a part of the process. But our focus is so much on value design and using decision making or using other rationally driven tools, that we sometimes lose sight of how what we are talking about as values have meaning for people who are going to be impacted by that.
No, of course, when I meant values, I don't mean only by people at the top, people who are making these decisions, but how it is perceived at various, I mean, by various actors, including the people that, I mean, I looked at the people and the communities as stakeholders themselves.
Okay, so when you say that, I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong. I hate to assume, but I'm sort of like assuming here that when you say that, you're actually taking into consideration the meanings that are constructed by the various actors, right?
Right.
But when I say actors, I mean both the policymakers and those that are going to be impacted by the policies.
Right.
So what was the means by which you drew data pertaining to that meaning-making process of people that were impacted?
It was an ethnography. I did a ethnography where I embedded myself in, what are called formal policy making venues, but also informal sites and venues where you have access to people and their conversations, deliberations, etc.
So then you are drawing meaning based on your observations. Am I correct?
Yes, participant observations, interviews, conversations, informal conversations, all of that.
Okay. So were you doing also semi-structured, in-depth interviews with people?
Yes.
Okay, because that is one tool, folks, that we use in qualitative research in order to understand how people construct meaning, right?
Yes.
Right, and it could be through symbolism, it could be through language, it could be text, it could be conceptual, it could be theoretical. I mean, there's a variety of ways in which we do that, but how meanings are constructed,
right,
is an important. So, but thank you for sharing. That was very valuable. That was nice. So you already are using somewhat of an interpretive framework in your policy making.
Yes, I mean, the idea was to move away from a positivist policy design, actually, to make room for people-centric or people-driven policy making in the true sense, in a bottom-up kind of a fashion.
Interesting. So are you working for a think tank, or you're working for an NGO?
No, this was for my PhD, which is actually now a book. But I still continue to use this framework in another context now, where I'm looking at datafication and the city. So I'm drawing on the same framework that I developed. It's called the deliberative policy ecology approach, and I'm trying to draw that to study data policy making and practices around data.
So where did you earn your PhD, Preeti?
This was from the University of Hyderabad in India.
Hyderabad. Okay. And are you done with your PhD now?
Yes. Done with my PhD. I'm just joining another place as a lecturer, and I'm in between jobs now. Yeah.
Interesting. Congratulations on
Thank you.
completing that arduous journey. I know how tough it can be. It's kind of like it has so many moving parts that
Yes.
it's just mind-boggling how you have to juggle so many different priorities, keep your work-life balance, keep all of that. So I commend you. Hats off to you for having completed that journey. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
sharing your thoughts with us. That's very appreciated. So I would like to open this to anybody else that can say something about this. Don't be shy. You may be a novice in the field, but if you don't take a chance with your ideas, right, you're not going to be able to get immersed in this learning. And I'm spending a considerable amount of time on this, where it was someone who's more experienced in policy making and design might think, this is all elementary stuff. All this stuff I already know. But unless you understand conceptually, right, and um, from a I'm looking for the word, from a phenomenological framework, when I say that, and I'll get into that in a second. Unless you know what phenomena you're working with, you're not going to be able to really make sense of what you're working with, really. Okay. So anybody else that would like to go?
Sir, Sanjay here.
Yeah, go ahead, Sanjay, please.
Yes, sir. So this is in the context of the word lockdown
Mm-hmm.
in the context of COVID-19.
Yeah.
So the way it was, um, what was intended from the word lockdown and what actually happened when it was
Mm-hmm.
implemented.
Mm-hmm.
If a lockdown is a policy action, but the complexity involved in the word lockdown for different people, we
Mm-hmm.
saw a different, what do you say, uh, behavioral patterns to
Mm-hmm.
those being city lockdown or, you know, so in that context, um, it was not interpreted in the same way as the policy was intended to be. So that led to people not adhering to the lockdowns, or because there were certain restrictions, whether I should follow it or not follow it. Then the legislation was used as a measure to implement it. So in
Mm-hmm.
that context, I see the word lockdown, what it means for different people is important. Uh, anyway, we experienced that in COVID, but in future, when we say lockdown, I think it is understood different by different people.
That's wonderful, and that will be a good segue for us as we get into the local knowledge, right? I talked about local knowledge, right? And
Yeah.
I asked you guys to look at that paper, Interpretive Policy Analysis, and just specifically read section 1 on the importance of local knowledge. And we'll talk about local knowledge. So in a sense, Sanjay, you've already talked about how different people look at the same phenomena and construct meaning differently,
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
so you use the word lockdown. How I experienced lockdown or how I make sense of lockdown may be quite different from how Reshma uh, or Resham makes sense of lockdown, or how Swati makes sense of lockdown.
Mhm.
Everybody's perspectives about something are different, right? So until a great deal of effort is made in messaging, and in the last session I talked about messaging, why messaging becomes so important. Okay. Um, Both the construction of the message, the delivery of the message, and the meaning of that message. It's so important because in such a diverse population, right, as such as India, right, uh, how does a person sitting in a village, right, and I hate to use the word illiterate because I've actually banished that word illiterate from my vocabulary, because illiterate suggests, and here again is meaning meant. Illiterate, right? If you look at the real, the actual dictionary meaning of illiterate is somebody that is not educated, somebody's that not. But to me, there is no such thing as an illiterate person. There is such a thing as illiterate assessors, those that take it upon themselves and put a spin on what literacy ought to be or ought to mean. Yes, a certain part of literacy is formal education, but is formal education all that it is cut out to be? Or can someone who has not had a bachelor's degree education or high school education, can that person not be literate? Right? So how I make sense of literacy may be very different from 10 other people who are making sense of literacy. So how we construct that meaning in our mind is the way that we are going to see that person, or in the way that we are going to experience that person. So if my focus, or if our foci as a think tank is on tackling the issues of literacy, and all of us are understanding literacy as formal education, then we could be going down a different rabbit hole. Because now literacy has a very nuanced meaning. And that nuanced meaning has to be taken into consideration when you're building policies. So let's say, if we say today, the literacy rate in Kerala, I'm taking the example of Kerala because for the longest time, Kerala was always thought of as the most literate state, where literacy meaning people could read and write and all that, right? So if I look at a certain framework and make that the microcosm, let's say we take Kerala and we start giving the example of Kerala to everybody. But a person who has a different idea of literacy in their mind or minds may not be comfortable with that notion of looking at Kerala as the most literate state. Because if I think of literacy as something other than reading and writing, if I look at literacy as a more nuanced way, then I'm not comfortable with that notion. So we have to be careful of what microcosms we are creating. Right? So I just thought I'd share that with you. So I would like to hear from others too on this. This is a very important aspect. How we make meaning, how we make sense. What do you have to say, Devinder? You've been quiet.
Sir, I'm not very much clear on this aspect actually. So just trying to understand better. But this thing is very much correct that different policies are subject to different interpretations by different stakeholders. That is very clear. And a good policy making definitely has to include the various interpretations and the various stakeholders. That's why I have seen recently in Government of India what they are doing, that suppose they have to make some policy related to the food issues. So they publish on the website, they make a draft, they publish on the website, and they put a circular that anyone, if they want to suggest something or they want to alter something or something like that, they can upload their reference, their issues or their requests on the website by so and so date. And before finalizing the final policy, I hope that they will take into account all these details which are coming to them during the process.
Great, great. Thanks for sharing that. Now I know that this is a little bit of a screwed up concept, because when I say screwed up, I mean meaning in the sense that one person can look at it this way, another person looks at it very differently, but that also gives it richness. So let's go to Resham and Chester because their hands have been up for a while. So Resham, go ahead.
Sir, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
All right. So when I was listening to this word lockdown and its various interpretations, what I was
Mhm.
reminded of was feminism, which is rather not a word but a movement, but it has also been receiving extreme reactions from people because of the construction and the meaning that it receives. So I
Mhm.
think what the changes that feminism as a movement has gone through, and today with the introduction of intersectional feminism, that is
Mhm.
what I think finds its parallel in the interpretative approach, wherein we sort of focus more on multiplicity of ideas because of intersection of gender, caste, class, rationalizations, various racial ethnicities, and all of that. So I think this particular word is also very sensitive to meaning making and maybe fall under the category of public policy as well, because many decisions have been taken, especially quote unquote regarding women and for women, without taking into consideration the uh, larger impact of or consequence of that particular public policy.
That's amazing. That is very, very nice. And you brought in one of my favorite expressions, intersectionality. Okay. Because, and the example that I take there is, and thank you, Varishim, for sharing that. That was very, very enriching, this to me. One of the things that we hear a lot about is so-called, and I'll use the expression transgender, right? Okay. I will guarantee you that if you hear the word transgender, okay, or transgender individuals or transgender community or transgender people, different people have very different concepts, ideas, emotions, feelings around the transgender situation. And if you ask 10 people, I'll bet you that at least 8 or maybe 8 or 9 people are just going to use the transgender, quote unquote, without saying transgender individual, transgender people, transgender community, etc. Right? Because what we have done is we've taken the word transgender and objectified it. We've provided commodification to it without understanding that these are human beings, just like you and me. They have thoughts, they have feelings, they have emotions. And by objectifying that, we sort of nullify their importance. So, Resham, when you look at that, or when you hear the expression transgender, and you look at it from the standpoint of intersectionality, because you're talking about gender, you're talking about race, you're talking about the marginalization of, let's say, Dalits or tribals or whatever in India. What comes to mind as it relates to this issue of hearing something, hearing an expression, and jumping to a conclusion?
Um, Sir, it's Cheshta this side. So the
Yes.
answer to this can be our conditioning, first of all, in the social stigma that is associated with the people
Yeah.
belonging to, not even belonging, I mean the sense of othering that are associated with people that belong to a different sexuality, and
Yes.
wherein we as a society have been conditioned to sort of uh, work in ways that have been passed on since generations. So the counter questions, and there is a lack of dissent. So I think that is where the understanding for the word and of the word transgender and its sexual undertones and intersections of the entire LGBTQ community, for that matter, comes into play, wherein people are not ready
Yes.
to accept it. So,
Correct. And you brought in a very, very important expression, the othering, that they're the other. It's so easy to think about something as the other, not knowing that there are pieces of the other that are inside of us. that they're other, as in they're different. They're different from us. And when somebody is treated as different, that our own value systems come into play, our own judgments come into play about them. And there's a whole body of work that is being done in critical phenomenology and critical race theory and all that, where we're trying to draw meanings out of that. But this other, this aspect of the other is a critical aspect. So if you are bringing in, if you are a policymaker, and I know Tanmay has raised his hand, so I'm going to give you a chance to talk about this, Tanmay, in a second. But if you're thinking, if you're part of a policymaking group or policy analysis group per se, and you have value judgments around, let's say, the transgender community, and you were raised to either dislike them or treat them as different or treat them as other or treat them as outcasts from society. Of course, they live at the margins of society, right? These are marginalized people. So, or if you think of that in my childhood, but I'm taking my example. I don't want to go that far. I'm taking my example. Growing up in India, I would think of them as, coming in singing songs or making a show of it, or weddings or birth of a child. They immediately know the new child is born and they come for donations and all that. And if you don't give them donations, they start harassing you, or they start exposing themselves and all that, and create all sorts of drama and stuff. So if I carry that in my mind, I will be scared of them. And anytime we don't understand someone or something, we don't want to accept that person as part of mainstream, then fear creates more fear. And it inevitably gets into a process of judgment. So if I'm part of a policymaking think tank and I'm creating policies around the transgender community, my policies will be biased, because the meaning that I've constructed in my mind about them is so obtuse, it is so insensitive, because I've dehumanized them already. And anything or anyone that you dehumanize, you look at differently. So go ahead, Tanmay. I know your hand has been raised. Thanks for your patience.
Hello, sir. And my sincere greetings to everyone who is participating.
Okay.
I mean, I was going to the recording of the past session. I unfortunately could not attend it, and really I've been impressed with the versatility of the ideas that have come to witness. Anyway, so talking about the matter at hand, I believe, sir, I mean, coming from a law background, I seem to witness that the dynamic in this country, India, has been that any policy development has always been followed by a struggle first. And I think that has sort of become, it's sort of a reflection of what kind of society we are. I mean, there has to be a wide struggle in order to be noticed, in order to become a part of the policy of the country. And more important factor that has come into picture these days is the struggle is not enough. It has to reflect with the ideas and the values of those who are, in the position to make that policy. Yeah, so that's what I would like to say about that, sir.
Yeah, that's great. Everything is followed by some sort of a struggle. So and that's where public advocacy comes in. That's what the crusaders are doing, right? They're trying to shape the policy that has been instituted, that before it goes into effect, before it is implemented and starts to hurt people, there are groups that will come in and shape the outcomes. So that's great. And somebody else is also written. Thank you for sharing that, Tanmay. Somebody else has raised the hand. I don't know who this person is. I can only see your avatar, your picture, but your name is not appearing here. So go ahead
Yes,
and talk,
Kritika
please.
and Harika.
Yeah, okay,
Yes, Kritika
Kritika,
and
go ahead.
Harika.
Uh, Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, Kritika, you're very audible.
Yes. So, sir, really, I really appreciate the kind of discussion we are having over this session.
Mhm.
So,
Okay.
but sir, what I could understand from our discussions that
Mhm.
before we were discussing about the different stockholders which we have during our policy making. So
Mhm.
I would like to give a classic example that I could relate to regarding this different multi stockholders that we have during our policy initiation and policy making. So
Mhm.
recently, I was actually involved within a cause, which actually the full form of that organization is Alliance for Sustainable and Holistic Agriculture.
Ah.
Devendra sir was talking about food policy making, and recently I think most of the people here would be knowing about the food fortification policy that our prime minister is bringing in the country to fight for this to tackle the nutritional deficiency that we have in our country. Now, when I was looking for policy papers or when I was researching for it, because my supervisor, my mentor wanted to talk about that bringing in this policy issue because there are different multi stockholders, and it might be though it might be very promising for the corporations, for the different food tech companies to bring in. But for small marginal farmers, it will be very difficult. I'll tell you why. Because when we try to bring this policy will try to universalize certain nutrients over others. Like we have a very huge deficiency of iron in our country. Anemia is a prolonged problem in our country, and
Mhm.
because of that they will try to choose some certain food samples which will they will try to universalize this whole of the country. Now in a country like India we have different food staple. In South India or in Northeast India, I think rice is a major food crop, but not in all over the India. Like I think in North India, wheat, bajra, other food crops are more important. So they will select certain food items and they will try to mix it with certain chemical components, which that is what I could understand from that from her conversation with her, and that components will be actually chemical components will be processed in different factories and companies, and which the amount of equipment and the investment in the infrastructure that cannot be bear with our marginal farmers. So it can be a very promising and a very um, enthusiastic decision for corporations. But I think when we think about marginal farmers who are right now in a country are already fighting against farm bills and all of the other pressures, I don't think so that will sit well with marginal farmers. So that's what I was trying to say, that different stockholders, when they come into a policy making issue, they have different share in the diagram, in the chart. And because they have different investments, different expenditures, they will try to obviously look into what will actually further their interest more. So that's what I was thinking, and those ideas were playing in my mind when we were discussing about stockholders in a policy making. So that's what I was trying to see.
Wow, what an awesome. I thought you were giving us a mini lecture here. Are you in education?
No, sir. I'm actually working for a startup right now in Guwahati. So I wish to
Okay,
be a part of education. I'm thinking of
wonderful.
pursuing
I would highly encourage you. You are so articulate in the way you express your ideas. And this is it's not one of the really mainstream topics that people discuss, but the nuance and the complexity with which you have presented your thoughts, hats off to you. That's amazing.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I would really encourage you to pursue where education, of course, and public policy, because I think you really are doing a great job of it. And you would definitely, I would encourage you to definitely get into teaching. So education, you could go into education just for the sake of earning a degree and not do anything with it. You can join an organization and become part of the workforce. But here I'm talking about teaching. And having really worked with literally hundreds, if not thousands, of students over my career, I can sense the ones, I can almost pick the ones that are going to be amazing teachers out there. So I just thought I'd share that with you. But thanks for a terrific piece, and in the way you articulated your thoughts. It was really very meaningful. We'd like to hear from somebody else. This is an important discussion. What are your thoughts, Swati, on
Yeah,
what's been
I
going
mean,
on?
I've heard really interesting, I think, experiences that everyone has spoken about, and I think this is a great way because what we are reading here and what you're talking about sounds so complex, but then the way Kritika and others have explained this kind of helps us understand how this can actually be implemented in real life, right? So it kind of makes us understand what it looks like on the ground. So, I mean, really, really interesting perspectives, I think. And to what Kritika said, I mean, Kritika, I think food security is such such an emerging, evolving field, and there is so much to do there. I would highly kind of encourage you to maybe read more about it and write more about it because there's just so much to do there. Yeah.
Great. So
And
somebody
Niharika
else had,
also has her hand up,
Niharika. Yeah, go
so
ahead,
I just
Niharika.
wanted to. Yeah.
Hi, good evening, everyone. So, adding on to what everyone has spoke about so far, I feel like this problem that a lot of people don't see themselves, getting the benefit out of these policies. I think it sort of boils down to the representation, in the sense that, for example, how someone talked about like 10 minutes back how that the government has like a portal for feedback and all of that stuff, but how many people do really know of that portal in the first place? For example, I came to know of that portal right now, and I am someone who's like massively privileged and whatnot, and I don't have to face the digital divide and things like that. And even when we look at research or policy think tanks which help out with policy. I mean, how many people from marginalized communities or multi, diverse backgrounds come into the picture? Is it the same people who keep making policies for everyone? Do they try doing a one size fits all? Because, like you said, Professor, that there's an inherent bias in everybody. So unless there's active representation and not just token representation that we keep one of every kind sort of a thing, if that even happens. So the policies will come out biased at the end of the day. And when people do take to streets, or for example, someone talked, I think Kritika talked about food security, and she mentioned that how the farmers have been out there since a while now. They've been out there since almost a year at this point. And when people try to do that, they're further, there's in media and news and pop culture, they're sort of vilified in a way, and then it inherently, the bias goes even deeper. So it's sort of like a loop at the end of the day. And how does one go break it is, I feel, by if there's some sort of equity, that, but I don't know how to sort of see it happening, because all I see is the loop at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point. That's really interesting. So it's a very complex area, and that's why we are spending time on this, because what we're going to try to do is Swati and I are going to have put together for the next two sessions uh, an intensive case study, okay? Because what we want to do is in today's session to be able to give you some thoughts, some ideas about what is the interpretative approach and encourage you guys to read up on interpretative policy analysis and all that. And then in the next two sessions have maybe one exhaustive case study or two small case studies that we can deconstruct together and figure out what's going on in that situation. What is the situation of inquiry? As a matter of fact, my next session was going to be on the use of situational inquiry in grounded theory, how to construct meaning of something, right? How to construct a new policy, how to or construct a new theory or refine an existing theory, okay? That and that is the framework, the essence that we use in grounded theory. So I want to talk about that also in the next session. But in today's session, I wanted to spend a lot of this time on interacting, because interaction and dialogue brings forward meanings that otherwise may remain hidden in our minds, right? Because the worst thing that can happen is we take away all of these unspoken, untalked about issues, and then we construct our own meaning without exposing ourselves to the ideation of other people that we are working together on with. So anybody else who would like to have, somebody else's hand is up there also. I can only see your avatar there. Yeah, is it
Can you hear
Nishant?
me? Yes, sir.
Yes, Nishant, go ahead.
So hello everyone. Sir, my question is regarding the methodology part. So I would like to put up two questions here. One, mostly I've seen people who are following the interpretism are likely to follow adverse approach. Is it that it's the only approach which can be followed in interpretism? First question
No,
is this.
no, absolutely not. Go ahead, but share your second question.
Yeah, that answers. But let me have one more question on this. While we can have the other approaches also in interpretism, how would we say that we have interpreted? Because whenever I see actors approach, there is a chance of interpreting in that research. But the system speaks for itself. The system approach or the analytic approach speaks for itself. So the concept of interpretism, does it get lost somewhere? And the second question, sir, most of the technological studies are under implementation. Most of the studies like AI and blockchain. So I was thinking to take up a thesis level study in that. But the problem is, since most of them are under implementation phase or pilot testing phase, it becomes a little difficult for me to chase it. What's your take on that? How can we do it with the lack of literature and possibly the lack of secondary data as well?
Swati, what do you think?
Because some of my guides have told me to drop the idea. Yeah.
Nishant, can you just elaborate on the question a little bit, like what exactly?
No, what I'm trying to say, let's talk about future technology. Let's say blockchain implementation in any of the use cases, or artificial intelligence maybe. Now you don't have entities who are using such softwares. When you don't have entities using such softwares, you don't have secondary data.
Interesting.
So that is a problem. While that's why we cannot do a quant study on that. Now, when you go to the qual section, it's just the perception of the stakeholders who predict that this thing can happen and these are the benefits that can come into the field. But now those opinions and perceptions are just perceptions and there's nothing concrete about it. And I'm willing to take up this research. How do I go about it?
So you have, go ahead, Swati, what is your take on that? I have some idea on this.
my take, I mean, in this instance, I can actually very well kind of identify with the issue Nishant is having, because this is something I've also struggled with. I'm working on tech platforms, research on tech platforms like Uber and Ola and all, and I also have the same issue where there is no data available, and all I have to rely on is, like you said, qualitative secondary, qualitative sources. And so my solution to this was to do more of an exploratory research over doing research that has like a clear hypothesis, and then you're either proving the hypothesis or nullifying the hypothesis. My solution to this was doing a more exploratory research, because this is a field where you do not have, you don't have significant literature or significant work to rely on. So what I did was I went ahead with a very loose form of an idea to kind of explore what the ecosystem looks like, what the main actors are, what negotiations take place between these actors, and how these different actors, like Nishant said, interpret the policy problem or the policy issue. So, I mean, that was, I think, that has kind of helped me in coming up with something that is credible, coming up with something that has research findings that can be used in the absence of actual quantitative data.
But you must be having some users of that technology. Now, when the technology is actually implemented, there is no problem
Yeah,
as such
you,
interpreting.
mhm.
Now, the point is, while you are working on the perceptions, it might so happen that the testing phase may fail in future, and you don't have anything concrete about it. In most cases, in qualitative study, you tend to get the responses from the users or the stakeholders after the implementation. Now, the problem here is you don't have an actual model implemented anywhere. So that was my question, a little different from what you did. So I'm struggling with it, looking
So,
forward for
so,
an answer.
okay. So your first, I'll try to take this. So your first question was, is there only one interpretative approach? Interpretative is a lens through which you look at different approaches. So even discourse analysis could be part of interpretation, to the interpretative lens. Phenomenological analysis can be part of interpretative work. Narrative analysis can be part of that. Discourse analysis, of course, I just mentioned. So you can have a lot of different qualitative approaches that can be looked at through this lens of interpretation. So think of the interpretative paradigm as a lens through which you look at. So even if you read the book that I sent you, the entire book by, I forget the name of the author, but Devro or somebody, she has talked about the variety of different approaches. She's not locking into one particular way. It's a philosophy. It's a philosophical presupposition, okay, that you have to take into account. What is the philosophy? So if you have a different interpretative philosophy, right, you could be looking at a different approach. So it's not one size fits all. The second one, your question, is a very important question. So what if you want to go ahead and do research in sort of like a virgin territory, which is like emerging right now, but there's not enough data out there? For instance, I'm helping a doctoral student who's doing her study on digitalization, and she's doing a study in the automobile industry, okay, with more and more cars becoming smarter and smarter now, with lane assist, automatic braking, all the alerts, the rear view camera, the front cameras, whatnot. So you are totally surrounded by technology. And so how, if that technology is transferred, and I think part of it may already, you correct me if I'm wrong, part of it is already coming in by the Japanese manufacturers into cars in India. But let me say this. So if you simply say somebody's sitting in Japan, or someone sitting in India says, hey, you know what? We want to bring in this technology because we want Indians are so savvy. Everybody's using a smartphone. We all understand all of that stuff. Okay, that's all great. So I'm not questioning that someone could not understand the software that goes with an automobile, okay, or the technology that goes with the automobile, whether it's lane assist. I know that anybody can understand that. But the issue there is, what are the experiences that people have had of using that technology on Indian roads, where, pardon me, but a lot of times you go, whether on all the metro areas, I'm talking about Mumbai and Delhi and Bangalore and all of these areas, there is no such thing as a lane in which you're traveling. Everybody is the wherever you're traveling, going by car becomes your lane. Right? So if you have lane assist, which is something that alerts you if you're veering off from your lane and going into an adjacent lane, so it's providing you that alert so that you don't get into an accident, right? Or you don't fall asleep at the wheel. It'll give you like a little jerk on the steering wheel. So you immediately alerted to that. But if we don't understand the local knowledge, by local, I mean, what is actually happening on the Indian roads, would that kind of technology not become a counterintuitive technology to introduce? Right? So the local knowledge is important, but if that is not already implemented in India, there is not enough data available. So you cannot use the data that Japan has, or the US has, or UK has, or Sweden has about those cars. The more, shall we say, the more technologically advanced countries. If we don't have those experiences in mind, and we want to go ahead and do research in this area, how do we go about doing this research? So Nishant, what would be your thoughts around that? So if I were to say, Nishant, it's a great idea, you do research on this kind of automation, or do this kind of transfer of technology into newer cars that are coming out, and you have no current data available, no secondary data, as you call it, because it's not been used. So you don't have the experiences of people. How would you go about doing research in that area?
I think the users from Japan and USA could be considered as a respondent in this case. And their responses could give us an insight how this can happen in India also. That
But
is
how would
a
a
comfortable
person,
zone to do it.
now how would a car user in Japan be able to throw light on the experience of a car user in India on an Indian road?
Maybe certain context can be applied here.
Okay.
Small changes to reflect the cultural diversity here and how people are moving on roads. This can be done somehow. This can be done.
Yes. So there are other things that come into play here. The enforcement of traffic rules. For instance, I was thinking about this, and I was talking to my student who's doing this automobile research and about the use of technology and all in more Indian cars that are coming out. And we said, perhaps you could look at it from the standpoint of only the super highways. There are a lot of nice now toll roads and highways where people are, by and large, at least obeying traffic rules and stuff. So maybe we could start to have like a test market or test drives on those roads to see how it works, because it'd be so difficult to go to Chandni Chowk in Delhi, or to Connaught Place in Delhi, right? Or to Residency Road in Bangalore, where there is no semblance of a traffic. And what is it? And if you're going bumper to bumper traffic on your way to the airport in Andheri, what is the poor car going to do? It's going to keep braking. If it has an automatic braking system, that automatic braking system will get totally thrown off sync because the car is thinking that you're going to collide with somebody, whereas actually you're going bumper to bumper traffic. So these are some of the things that we have to consider, and that's what I was meaning by local knowledge. So we have to consider that local knowledge before we start bringing stuff in, before we start to transfer the technology. It's unlike is a smartphone. Smartphone is great. I mean, everybody's using smartphones now. There is no issue there. But when you start to have that kind of transfer of technology, transfer of really high-tech technology I'm talking about, to Indian automobiles, how would people make meaning of that? And then how does the local knowledge of what we acquire from the local knowledge going to impact the efficacy of that, or the usefulness of that, or the utility of that? So that is something that we need to consider. Now, Dr. Vani Lakshmi has written here, and I'm going to read out here. I'm a novice here based on my love and learnings from the discussion. I understand that IPA attempts to address societal issues by looking at different meanings for different groups of people through strong theoretical foundations that we are introduced to in the book. I've just started reading the book this evening. However, what we are accounting, how are we accounting for time here? For instance, lockdown was different for me in 2016, 2019, and 2021, including the loopholes. How does IPA stand the test of time and spatial aspects, example, UK, India, and the US, in terms of the quantitative approach? Okay, in terms of the quantitative approach, it's a matter of extrapolation. So that's a pretty elaborate comment there and very well thought out. So I'll turn it over to you guys. What do you think? How do you think? I'm sure some of you have read at least parts of the IPA book. How does this come into play there? What Dr. Vani Lakshmi has just shared with us. So there are two aspects. One is the spatial aspect, and one is different theories for different groups, different meaning making. How do we sort through that? How do we make sense of that when we are using interpretative policy analysis? When we're building policies, how do we account for the time period? So the way a person constructs meaning in, let's say, 2000, and she was constructing meaning of lockdown in 2016, 2019, and 2020, and it meant differently in different time periods. And then, of course, the context, UK, India, and the US. How are they different? How was lockdown seen differently in India, US, UK? How do we account for those nuances? How do we account for those differences of geography, even culture? For instance, you've all heard of the anti-vaxxers in the US. There's a huge faction, at least about 30%, currently about 25 to 30% of the US population that just does not want to get vaccinated. Part of that is a political issue there, but part of that is also an ignorance / wanting to know more, wanting to have more information about something. They're not certain that they want a vaccine to go into their bodies. They don't know what the side effects might be, while they're forgetting that we all have been inoculated, vaccinated as we grew up as children. The measles vaccine, the TB vaccine, or whatever, the vaccine around so many other diseases, polio, and this anti-polio and all that. So, but we fight that new vaccine because there isn't enough data there. So there's a logic there, right? For those people. Now, I don't buy into that logic because I'm saying that I believe in science, and if the scientists are saying it's safe, then I should take it. So I got my 2 shots of vaccine. I'm getting my booster dose on Monday for the Moderna vaccine. But another person looks at it differently. So how do we account for those differences, account for that diversity in our analysis? And there is an answer right there from Resham and Chester to everyone. I think since public policy is an ongoing and iterative process of going back and forth between the parts to the whole and the wholes to the part, we need to go back and forth to take into account the time and spatial aspects. So there is not, and I think that is a wonderful observation. Thank you, Resham and Chester, because you don't look at policy analysis or interpretative policy analysis as one moment in time. Now, granted that whatever public policy you're designing or crafting is situated, is relevant and contextual in relation to that time or place. But if you were to go back and analyze that policy, so let's say the policy was constructed, this is to Dr. Lakshmi also. Let's say the policy was constructed in 2017, when we didn't have the pandemic, right? The pandemic came basically about 20 months ago. So a policy was constructed around whatever area in that moment in time. But 2019 or 2020, I believe, we started to see or hear about the pandemic, fast and furious. So if we were to analyze a policy when the pandemic was not even existent, if we were to analyze that same policy in a moment of time when the pandemic is raging or was raging, how could we analyze it? And I want to share, and I want to throw this out to the group. How would you make room for the changes that have occurred socially, economically, geopolitically, especially when you're going ahead and analyzing that policy? This is a critical piece in IPA. How do we make room for that? It's okay that we are doing the iterative process. We're going back and forth. But back and forth on what? What process are we going to follow? How would we make sense of that process? How do we make meaning, especially when we are now dealing with something that was not even present in 2017? How do we make room for that? So Dr. Vani, how about we hear you? What do you have to say about this? Oh, okay. Okay, she has, okay, so Dr. Vani has network concerns, that's fine. So you can just write your message here. That's a prop. I hope, hopefully that should be okay with you. How would you answer, how would you address your own question here, given what you're hearing through our conversations? And also knowing that IPA is not one size fits all. It's not a one structured way of doing the research or doing the policy analysis. It's a very organic, very emergent way of doing it. Yeah, please type it at length. That'd be fine. While you're typing it at length, and quantitative policy research should go hand in hand, and we should think local and work global. Okay, so, all right. So the first thoughts, I think IPA and quantitative policy research should go hand in hand. Well, of course, like with any policy analysis, there isn't a singular approach of doing it. Clearly, we use multiple methods, and especially if you're doing in a research endeavor, if you're using a mixed methods approach, we could be using quantitative and qualitative both, which actually produces a richer research, and in this case, richer policy construction or policy analysis. What would be some of the other thoughts around that? Go ahead, Tanmay.
Thank you, sir. So, sir, when we talk about this, so I really take a, you know, my outlook is really in back of my head. I think of law and legal systems, and because they are ultimately, the implementers of policy. So I really can't specifically put it in the terms of time, but in terms of spatial differences, I think we can take into account the historical experiences and the cultural development that has been in that particular country or region, and how the legal system in that country responds to it. So for example, when we make a policy in US, because we have a very sort of very rigid system that it's not very flexible, so every time there can't be a new amendment. uh, the policymakers have to think and take into account various factors, so that they do not have to change the law time and again. However, when we see in terms of UK and India, it's a sort of a little more flexible um, system here. So once the interpretation or the outlook of the society towards a particular object changes, there's a easier scope for it to be interpreted in a different manner. I mean, according to the contemporary understanding of that object.
Right. That's good. That's good. Anybody else? This is a dilemma that you're going to face in public policy analysis, because we're analyzing. See, there are two aspects to it. One, you're constructing a new policy. That's a separate process by itself. And one is you're analyzing a policy that already is in place. That's what interpretative policy analysis is. And sometimes you'll do an interpretative policy analysis because it's a purely research endeavor, because we are collecting some more data around how a policy is working. But sometimes an interpretative policy analysis is a process where you're trying to not only examine an existing policy and make sense of the existing policy, but also trying to improve that policy. And how can you improve something unless you're able to deconstruct and analyze it? Right? And that's where the grounded theory method comes in, where grounded theory is about crafting a new approach, or looking at an existing approach, looking at an existing theory or crafting a new theory. So if you're looking at an existing policy using the interpretive policy analysis and you're running into this challenge, how would you encounter that challenge? How would you, well, you encounter it, but how would you go through it? How would you make sense of that? And for that, I urge you to really go into that book. I shared that book for a reason. I only asked you to look at the local knowledge aspect because there's so much content in there. But if you start reading the subsequent chapters, I think all of this stuff will start to have more meaning. And also Luigi Corini or some, I shared a paper on interpretative approach in public policy and international relations. That's an excellent piece. And as a matter of fact, I made it easier. I've highlighted in yellow a lot of the stuff that I want you to actually focus in on in that paper. So before you go into the interpretive policy analysis and read additional chapters, I would encourage you to go into the interpretative piece, that article by Luigi, and read those pieces that I've highlighted. I think it'll make more sense to you when you start to look at that. So it's a very organic approach, and that's what a lot of qualitative approaches are. There's no one set way of doing things. It's not a structured chart or a method or a process or a flow that you're going to follow. Yes, it's scientifically driven. It's definitely robust. It's rigorous how you do it, because you're just not throwing darts in the dark. You are looking at it from a substantive approach, from a well thought out approach, from a good philosophical underpinning, and also to a large extent a theoretical understanding of something, without using that understanding theoretically to apply to a situation until you're able to collect more data and make sense of that. So I would encourage you to read up that part and it'll make more sense to you. So what is IPA? Values as a point of departure. So I want to talk about, we've had a really good segment on the discussion around these aspects. Thank you so much for all of you for sharing your ideas and your own vision and outlook on that, which is really helpful. But let me just give you some of the more additional ideas on IPA. So values as a point of departure. So we start with examining values as a starting point of departure, meaning a starting point. So it's a shift from the cost benefit analysis and a quantifying of non-monetary values to advocacy planning and participatory decision making. So we are shifting from a heavy cost benefit pragmatic approach, which is used in quantitative studies, and a quantifying of non-monetary values. So values that you cannot put a monetary value on, we tend to also quantify them. We put a dollar value or a rupee value on those, thinking that we need more data that is quantitative in nature. So shifting from a quantitative approach to a more qualitative approach with advocacy planning and participatory decision-making, where you're taking into account a group, their feelings, their ideas, their notions, before we actually make decisions. IPA shifts the focus of values as a cost-benefit analysis to values as a means of understanding the players' subjective thoughts, feelings, and emotions about a proposed policy. This is a very important aspect. As a matter of fact, it is the essence of their approach. So it shifts the focus of values as a cost benefit analysis to values as a means of understanding the key players. Key players are both, by the way, the people that construct the policy and people whose lives are going to be affected by the policies. So it's almost like a co-construction of meaning, of understanding the key players' subjective thoughts, feelings, and emotions. So subjectivity plays a vital role. And subjectivity, just so you know, Dr. Lakshmi, is not that the entire process is only drenched in subjectivity, that there is no objectivity, there's no quantitative studies there. It can be both. But when we are looking at an interpretative approach, you're going to have a heavier emphasis on subjectivity. How meaning is constructed is as important to analysis as the meaning in and of itself. So how you construct meaning is as important as what that meaning represents to you. Interpretative approaches do not lack rigor, method, or structure, despite the focus on subjectivity and human enterprise. So this is, I'm just repeating what I was just saying, that an interpretative approach that we use is a rigorous approach. It has a certain approach, a methodological framework. It has a structure. Even though the structure may be organic, the structure may be emergent, even the structure changes from situation to situation, but it has a structure nonetheless. So despite its focus on subjectivity, which is what some people poo-poo it and says, oh, it's all subjective, it's all about emotions, thoughts, feelings, whereas the data. So I want you to understand that this is an important aspect of that. So so Preeti said she has a power cut there. Okay, that's fine. So here we are using the interpretative approach and looking at rigor, method, or structure. So on this slide by itself, I'd like to hear from you some of your thoughts. I know you've got some hands have gone up. What was the first one? Go ahead. Somebody's hand has gone up. I forget your name. You joined the group. Go ahead, please. What are your thoughts on this?
Hi, Dr. Bear. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Rishab. That's it. Rishab. Yes. Go ahead. I'm sorry. For a minute there, I forgot your name.
No issues. So I
Okay.
didn't really have a point of view. I had more of a question here.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that cost-benefit analysis is undertaken in public policies is because oftentimes there are contradicting points of view between stakeholders. While one stakeholder would want X, the other stakeholder would want the entire opposite of X, which can be Y, Z, or what have you. Now, with cost-benefit analysis as the approach, you can actually quantify and measure which point of view to take forward in your policy and how to balance it. However, in iterative approach, how would we measure the contradicting points of view, and how would we resolve them or make a policy out of those contradicting approaches, points that two different stakeholders have?
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. What was your question?
Yeah, so that was my question as to how to. So cost benefit analysis lets us measure as to what each stakeholder would do. But with interpretative with the IPA approach, we do not have a quantity to measure. We have experiences of different people to measure. But those experiences aren't something that can be measured against each other. We can't say that because X did this, therefore Y can have that.
Exactly. There is no X and Y there. That's not like it's not based on variables. It's not based on regression analysis. It's not based on some of the other stuff that you you think of when you think of research. Okay, when you think of research as quantitative. Correct?
Yes, but so my question was essentially that in cause benefit analysis, we can say, okay, this is the point of view, this is the part that we are taking because the cost benefit analysis says so. With
Mhm.
a non with an IPA approach, how would we choose that part if there are contradicting stakeholders?
Yeah, so that is the whole beauty of the interpretative approach, because that is also it's both the beauty and the complexity of the approach, because a lot of people are making sense of the policy in a different way. So how do you bring in so many disparate elements, so many dots out there, so many different ideas, so many different frameworks, so many different interpretations into creating a policy that benefits the majority? Now, you cannot obviously, if your policy is going to affect 1 crore people, right, or 1 lakh people, you cannot obviously take the ideas of 1 lakh people into account. So you take microcosms, you take representative groups into your policy framework, and you create. So there is, and this is the part, because there is no policy out there, whether it is produced quantitatively or qualitatively, that's going to be the most effective one, that's going to be most accurate, that's going to be without any problems down the road. You're always going to have problems. You're always going to have um, areas you're going to have to examine that policy to see how that policy made sense. Is it really effective or not? So I would encourage you, Rishabh, to read up the articles that I've sent you, especially the one on the interpretative approach, where I've extensively highlighted in yellow. Read up that paper. It's not a very big paper to read. You can go through it within an hour or so. Will give you a lot of information on that. Read that first, and then read the work, the entire book. I mean, obviously not the entire book, but just a couple of chapters in the interpretative policy analysis book that I shared with you. So it will give you a sense of how to go about it and how to make sense of it, how to make meaning of it. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Tanmay, did you have
Thank
anything
you.
to say? Tanmay, did you have anything to
No, sir.
add
No,
here?
sir.
Tanmay, did you have anything to add here? Okay. All right, great. So let me go in. What is policy analysis? What do analysts do? We're going to be talking a lot about that in the case studies in the next week and in the last session. The policy analysts can be advisors to policymakers, advocates for a particular community, non-profit enterprises and lobbying groups, think tanks, research groups. And here there was an interesting piece that I read about, and you'll see it in that book on interpretive policy analysis, which she talks in the introduction. Actually, I believe it's in chapter 1. You know, an interesting thing, it was an American-led survey that was done on like a comparative study about some dilemma, something that they had to research. And in the survey, because Americans, by their very nature, are so touchy about age, everybody, the whole emphasis in the States is about youth. And to a great extent, even in India right now, it's fast changing. So it is a great deal of emphasis on youth. So if you open a survey, and the very first question that you ask is, what is your age? people find it very offensive, almost, in the US. So in the US, they will never ask you your religion, they will never ask you your age, they will never ask you things of that nature, right? What is your ethnicity? Whereas these could be very accepted things in the Japanese culture. So for instance, because it was an American-led comparative study, they kept age as the last question. And what happened was something quite unforeseen. While the survey went well, they collected great data from the American counterparts. The data were skewed in the Japanese context because Japanese, actually, there's a lot of reverence around age. You know, a lot of people are very old. It's an aging population also. There's a great deal of regard, respect for someone's age. So as a matter of fact, if in the Japanese context they'd ask somebody, what is your age? It would be perfectly normal. It would not be considered as somewhat offensive, somewhat awkward to answer. So because this context, this local knowledge, as they would say, was not kept in mind in the Japanese version of that survey, the data that were collected were skewed. So here's an example of why it is so important to keep those nuances in mind when you're doing this. Importance of local knowledge. We talked about that local knowledge through our discussion, so I'm not going to go into all that, but I just wanted to share the local knowledge is based on practical meanings, considerations, context around lived experience of those that are impacted by the policy. You hear the expression lived experiences in phenomenology, in phenomenological research, where we are trying to understand the essence of a particular phenomenon. Interpretative presuppositions focus on multiple interpretations and pluralism, right? It is through deliberate dialogic encounters, dialogic means conversational dialogue encounters, that policy analysts attempt to understand the ramifications of policymaking. Knowledge is acquired through hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is interpretation. So interpretation could be meaning making, sense making, either of discourses or text. So either we're having a discourse around something or even looking at text. We call it, and I'll touch upon the non-human research, which is a form of content analysis just based on secondary data. Whereas those, you're not actually interviewing people. You're not trying to get their narratives through in-depth research interviews. So you could be looking purely at text, which is interviews, agreements, contracts, things of that nature, and trying to look for an unknown variable there. So this is all integral, a part of the policy analysis study or interpretative policy analysis in this sense. All right. So there's an intersection of hermeneutic phenomenology and policy analysis. We are at the time boundary right now, so I'm not going to get into that. Today, I will make it a point to touch upon that, how phenomenology and phenomenological analysis can play a vital role in interpretative policy analysis. So with that, we come to an end of today's session. And real quick, anybody has any thoughts to share before we end? Yes, go ahead.
Sir, while I was going through some research papers, people have frequently coined new terms in their research papers. So,
Uh-huh.
what is your idea about it? Why? How do people do it? Is there a process of doing it, or you just
Say
need
that
to
again.
mention it in
I
the
didn't
research?
catch. I didn't catch your first part of your
I mean,
question.
I'm coming across some papers where people have coined new terms. They have brought new
Ah,
terms to the literature.
void new terms into the literature. Like, give me an
Yeah.
example of a new term.
Let's take the example of triple entry accounting. So
Uh-huh.
it's a blockchain based accounting system. If you
Okay.
club accounting in blockchain, you get a new type of system. Now they're
Okay.
calling it a triple entry system.
Okay. Okay.
So how
And
do they
your
do it?
question
What is
is,
the
so what are my thoughts around that? You're
yes?
saying?
Because at times people question why you have used particular term for it, why you have coined it, and
Mm-hmm.
while somebody is bringing it into the literature, what
Mm-hmm.
all he has to do differently? Is he
Okay.
supposed to go through a process before introducing a term,
Yeah.
or what exactly happens? One, and second, earlier we have seen from the Western world specifically, people used to
Uh-huh.
coin the theories with respect to the names, like
Okay.
Darwin theory and all. Now we don't see that thing happening today. What
Mm-hmm.
all has changed and what made it? Was it a matter of just comfort and first advantage that people used to do it? What has changed? We don't see nowadays that people are using their own name with the theories they bring in,
Mm-hmm.
and what qualifies to bring it. It has to be a significant literature, sorry, contribution or not.
Yeah. So you bring up a good question, and a lot of changes are happening in the way the vernacular is changing around different theoretical methods. And new as authors write, they bring their own ideas. Sometimes those ideas are glossed over, nobody pays attention. Sometimes those ideas are very compelling and they become constructs, they become new ways of looking at it, right? So what is my thought on that? My thought of that is, hey, go for it. If it adds new meaning, if it adds new significance, it adds value to a discussion, why not, right? So while it can be perplexing to a novice researcher such as Nishant, who's reading a paper and finding these new terms and terminologies, you have to be open to emergence. If you're going to be doing this qualitative approach, the interpretive policy analysis, you really have to be open to a lot of emergence, open to new ideas, open to new thoughts, right? Right, Rishabh?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. On that note, let me just quickly check we are having we are having complete freedom. Vandana to everyone. I think this is the essence of qualitative study. We have complete freedom. Okay, and that's why, yes, you're absolutely right. Vandana, you're absolutely right. Kashish, you're right. This is the whole essence of a qualitative approach versus a very quantitative approach. You are open to emergence, you're open to originality, you're open to creativity, and you have complete freedom to go in any direction that you want. And to be able to explore, you have to have a very exploring, very inquiring mind and do that. So with that, I would like to end the session. It's been a long session, 2 hours. And I want to thank each and every one of you that has taken a chance, taken a risk to share your ideas here with us. The only ideas that are not shared are the ones that become issues down the road and they fester. So wonderful. Do a great job. You're doing a great job. I'm really excited to, we got to put together, Swati unfortunately had to jump off because there was a power cut in the cafe that she was joining from. And so we understand that. Thank you, Swati, for letting me know. And we will put together some case studies, at least one exhaustive case study or two short case studies for us to look at okay, and see, using an interpretative phenomenology, interpretative public policy analysis, how do we go about making sense of those case studies, right? So with that, thank you so much. Have a nice night, and be well and be safe. And we will see you next week on the 30th, next Saturday. All right. Take care, guys. Bye. Right.
Thanks very much, sir. Have a great day.
Okay. You take care. Bye-bye.